I want to talk about pod rot of peanuts. In the West Texas area, most of our peanut disease problems are due to pod rot of peanuts. We have several different organisms that can be causing pod rot of peanuts. They're primarily fungi. We have one called rhizoctonia, which has been around a long time. It forms sometimes brown lesions on your stems, but most likely you'll have brown lesions being formed on the pods. They can be raised up a little bit. They can be sunken in a little bit. They're usually somewhat dry. They're not real gooey, wet type lesions. And they can be a range of colors from very light brown, even a little bit whitish, to very, very dark brown. The second organism that we have out here in abundance is called pythium. Pythium tends to form very, very black lesions, such as you see here. These tend to be gooey black, and the darker they are, usually the purer the pythium is that's infecting. If you have a combination of rhizoctonia and pythium, you'll see a dark brown as opposed to pure black color, and that usually means a mixed infection. But if it's really black and gooey, then it's probably almost pure pythium. The third organism, which is in a smaller percentage of fields, probably something under 5% of the fields in West Texas, is Sclerotium rothschii, also known as southern blight. Those lesions tend to be white to tan, and the fungus produces these little tiny balls, like the head of a pin, on the pods. And that's one way you can tell if you have Sclerotium rothschii. The primary ones are pythium and rhizoctonia, and they occur in about equal frequency in West Texas, so you have to be aware of both. The damage caused by pod rot is usually just straight loss. Your pods rot, you lose that yield directly. You also have a penalty in terms of your quality, and of course you're paid to a certain extent. If you have a certain percentage of pod rot, that's a direct penalty in terms of how much you're making for your peanuts. The other thing that you occasionally get with the pod rot organism, with pythium in particular, is you can get some plant death. This is an example of a pot that's starting to show some flagging, and as you walk through a field scouting, you will occasionally see a little bit of a wilt occurring with pod rot. Not always, but you can have that occurring as well. So you can have plant loss as well, but the most consistent problem is you simply get rot, loss of the actual kernels, and you take a hit in terms of the quality of your crop, which can affect your payments. Things that cause your disease problems to be worse, water is probably the first thing that comes to mind. Lots and lots of irrigation probably increases your pod rot, particularly when you pour the water in September on the field. I have not seen such a problem in July and August with overwatering, but September almost always leads to a pod rot problem. To manage pod rot, you basically have to use fungicides, chemicals. There's lots of products that you can use for rhizoctonia. They can a range of costs, a range of effectiveness, but you have a lot of choices with rhizoctonia. I want to talk about chemical control of pythium pod rot. You basically have two choices, a product called Rhizoctonia and a product called Abound. They both have their special requirements. Abound controls both pythium and rhizoctonia, but it's fairly weak on pythium, which means you've got to have the product out before you have a pod rot problem. You've got to be preventative. Rhizoctonia is much more effective on pythium, but that's all it controls is pythium. And so if you use Rhizoctonia, you either have to use a rhizoctonia product with it or only have pythium in your field. Rhizoctonia goes out either with chemigation, or you can buy a granular formulation that you put out granularly. You do not do sprays over the top with Rhizoctonia. You cannot get effective control that way. And so you have a good broad spectrum fungicide that you can apply any way you want that will control all your pod rot diseases if you get it out early enough, or you have a much better product for pythium, but that's the only thing it controls, and you have limitations with how you can apply it. And so that's basically the important points to remember when you're working with pod rot of peanuts. Once you have a problem, you probably have to go with your more effective materials. If you're scouting and you can catch things early, you have a wider choice of options. other methods of control for pod rot will not help you once you have a problem. A good rotation program with cotton can be useful. Something like a 3 or 4 year rotation with cotton can be effective, but not always. There are sometimes these organisms also go to cotton, and so you can select for a population that goes back and forth to both. So there's nothing guaranteed. There's no rotation that I can guarantee will eliminate a pod rot problem. But generally a 3 or 4 year rotation will reduce the chance of you having a problem, unless you're just unlucky in terms of having isolates that can go back and forth to both crops. In terms of other things, varieties, Tamspan 90 is a Spanish variety that has some resistance to pod rot. Generally, the Texas A&M releases have generally been a little more tolerant to pod rot, but most of our varieties are highly susceptible, and so you don't have a lot of good choices in terms of varieties. The question then becomes, how do you know you have a pod rot problem? And that has to do with scouting or with spraying by the calendar. Spraying by the calendar, and generally we recommend a 60 and a 90-day spray after planting, is the simplest way to do it, but you may be using fungicides that you don't actually need. You may be putting materials out there when you have no pod rot at all, and so you essentially would waste that application. However, you can use your cheapest materials, your most effective ones, in a preventative way if you spray by the calendar. The second way is to scout. You cannot accurately estimate how much pod rot you have with scouting. You'd simply have to go to too many locations, and I'm talking 50 or more locations each time you scout to adequately catch low levels of pod rot. The disease is too variable. So all you can do is see when the disease starts to increase with intensive scouting. You really can't accurately estimate pod rot. But by scouting, you can eliminate those early unnecessary sprays. You may get caught with a higher level pod rot before you then start treating, and so you do take a risk. You have an increased risk with the scouting method to decide when to spray, and so you have to weigh those alternatives in your program.